If a person offers you $5 million to become someone you are not, the real question is not how much the money is worth. The real question is what part of yourself you are willing to sell. Charlotte Bennett had spent most of her life believing every problem came with a price tag. As the founder and chief executive officer of one of the largest technology companies in America, she had negotiated billion-dollar deals, acquired competitors twice her size, and built a reputation for getting exactly what she wanted. Tonight, standing inside her glass-walled penthouse overlooking Manhattan, she expected another negotiation to end the same way. The city sparkled beneath her like a field of stars. A signed contract rested on the marble coffee table between them. Beside it sat a simple black folder containing one offer: $5 million. Across from her sat Marcus Reed. He wore a dark Henley shirt, faded jeans, and the calm expression of a man who had spent years solving real problems instead of talking about them. He looked completely out of place among the luxury furniture, designer artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows. Yet somehow he seemed more comfortable than she was. Charlotte crossed her arms. Most people would have signed already. Marcus glanced down at the contract again. His eyes moved across the pages one final time. Then he closed the folder and pushed it gently back across the table. The movement was quiet, respectful, final. Charlotte blinked. "You are refusing?" "Yes." She almost laughed. Nobody refused $5 million. Nobody. "Perhaps you misunderstood the number." "I understood it." "Then why say no?" Marcus leaned back slightly. His voice never changed. "Because my daughter would ask questions." Charlotte stared at him. Of all the answers she expected, that was not one of them. "You could explain it to her." "That would require me to lie. It is only a temporary arrangement." "Maybe." He looked directly at her. "But children learn from what we do more than what we say." For the first time in years, Charlotte found herself without a prepared response. Silence settled over the room. Beyond the windows, helicopters moved between skyscrapers. Traffic lights glowed far below. Marcus stood. "Thank you for considering me." She watched him reach for his jacket. "You are walking away from $5 million. "No." A faint smile touched his face. "I am walking toward my daughter." The words landed harder than she expected. Marcus nodded politely and headed for the door. A moment later, he disappeared into the hallway. The penthouse suddenly felt much larger, much quieter. Charlotte remained standing beside the contract. For years, she had measured people by ambition, influence, and success. Yet the man who had just left seemed guided by something she could not buy, negotiate, or control. She slowly sat down and looked at the unsigned pages. For the first time, the money felt small. And somewhere deep inside a place she rarely allowed herself to examine, a question began to grow. What kind of man turns down $5 million because of a promise he never wanted to break to his little girl? The next morning, Charlotte Bennett told herself she had forgotten about Marcus Reed. She repeated it while reviewing reports. She repeated it during conference calls. She repeated it while standing inside a boardroom filled with executives waiting for her decisions. Yet every time the room became quiet, she heard the same sentence again. "I am walking toward my daughter." By noon, the words had become impossible to ignore. Charlotte finally closed her laptop and stared through the glass wall of her office. Hundreds of employees moved below her. Millions of dollars moved through her company every hour. Investors listened when she spoke. Reporters followed her every move. But somehow a man in a dark Henley shirt had disrupted her thoughts more effectively than any competitor ever had. Late that afternoon, she found herself sitting inside the back seat of a black luxury sedan parked across the street from an elementary school. The decision felt ridiculous. She should have been preparing for an investor meeting. Instead, she was watching children run across a playground. Parents gathered near the entrance. School buses lined the curb. Then she saw him. Marcus appeared near the front gate, carrying a worn backpack over one shoulder. The moment a little girl spotted him, her entire face lit up. Olivia Reed ran toward her father with enough excitement to power the whole city. Marcus laughed and opened his arms. The girl practically launched herself into them. Charlotte watched him lift her effortlessly before setting her back on the ground. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No cameras, no audience, no business advantage. Yet she could not stop watching. Olivia talked nonstop while Marcus listened carefully, as though every word mattered. A few minutes later, the girl pointed toward her bicycle. Marcus crouched beside it and began fixing something near the chain. His hands moved confidently, patiently. The little girl sat beside him, swinging her legs while telling another story. Charlotte felt something strange tighten inside her chest. She remembered expensive schools, private tutors, security teams, nannies, drivers. She remembered growing up surrounded by people. Yet somehow she could not remember anyone looking at her the way Marcus looked at his daughter. The chain clicked back into place. Marcus stood and handed the bicycle to Olivia. That should have been the end of it. Charlotte should have asked the driver to leave. Instead, she remained there. Then Olivia suddenly pointed directly across the street, directly at the sedan. Charlotte froze. The little girl said something. Marcus turned. Their eyes met through the windshield. For 1 second, neither looked away. Charlotte expected judgment, curiosity, annoyance. Instead, Marcus simply nodded once. A calm acknowledgement. Nothing more. Then he took his daughter's hand and started walking home. Charlotte watched until they disappeared around the corner. The street felt strangely empty afterward. As the driver waited for instructions, Charlotte stared at the sidewalk where they had vanished. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering whether success could be measured by something other than money. And for the first time in years, she was not entirely sure she liked the answer. The following morning began with a problem Charlotte Bennett could not solve with a spreadsheet. Every report on her desk had numbers. Every meeting on her calendar had objectives. Every executive around her expected answers. Yet none of them could explain why she kept thinking about a man who had calmly walked away from $5 million. By mid-morning, the atmosphere inside headquarters had shifted. The board meeting that should have been routine turned tense. Investors wanted reassurance. Attorneys wanted signatures. Several members of the board wanted immediate action to address rumors surrounding an upcoming corporate restructuring. Charlotte sat at the head of the long conference table listening to arguments fly across the room. Usually she dominated discussions like these. Usually she had a plan before anyone else realized there was a problem. Today felt different. A legal advisor slid a document toward her. Without a stable public narrative, some shareholders may challenge your leadership position. Charlotte remained silent. Another executive cleared his throat. The perception issue is becoming difficult to control. Perception. The word lingered in her mind long after the meeting ended. That afternoon, she stood alone in her office overlooking Manhattan. Below her, millions of people moved through the city. Somewhere among them was Marcus Reed, a man with a small apartment, a daughter who adored him, and a life that somehow seemed more grounded than her own. Her phone buzzed. It was her chief legal officer. The update was worse than expected. The company needed stability. Public confidence mattered. Certain contractual requirements connected to ownership structures suddenly carried more weight than before. Charlotte ended the call and stared out the window. For the first time, the proposal she had made no longer felt like a convenience. It felt necessary. An hour later, she sat inside another car heading toward a neighborhood far removed from luxury penthouses and private elevators. The driver glanced in the mirror. "Are you certain about this?" Charlotte looked out the window. No. It was the most honest answer she had given all day. When they arrived, she spotted Marcus leaving a small grocery store carrying 2 bags. He wore jeans, a dark polo shirt, and the same calm expression she remembered. Before she could reconsider, she stepped out of the vehicle. Marcus noticed her immediately. Surprise crossed his face, followed by understanding. "You found me." Charlotte folded her arms, suddenly aware of how different their worlds looked standing side by side on an ordinary sidewalk. "I need to talk to you." Marcus glanced toward the grocery bags. "About the contract?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Traffic rolled past. Somewhere nearby, children laughed at a playground. The sounds felt strangely distant. "I already gave you my answer." Charlotte took a slow breath. For perhaps the first time in years, she allowed someone to see uncertainty. "Then maybe I need to explain why I asked." Marcus studied her carefully, not like a businessman evaluating a deal, like a person deciding whether another person was telling the truth. Finally, he nodded toward a nearby coffee shop. "You have 10 minutes. As they started walking together, Charlotte felt something unexpected. Relief. And for reasons she could not yet understand, that frightened her more than the crisis waiting back at the office. The coffee shop was nearly empty at that hour. Soft music played somewhere overhead, while sunlight filtered through the front windows and painted long golden shapes across the floor. Charlotte Bennett sat across from Marcus Reed at a small table that looked far too ordinary for a conversation that suddenly felt important. A paper cup of coffee rested untouched between her hands. Marcus listened quietly. He had not interrupted once since they arrived. That alone made him different from most people in her life. Everyone else usually rushed to offer advice, solutions, or opinions. Marcus simply waited. Charlotte looked down for a moment before finally speaking. The situation is more complicated than I explained. Marcus nodded. I figured that. A faint smile almost appeared on her face before disappearing again. The company is facing pressure from several directions at once. Investors are nervous. The board is nervous. The media keeps creating stories whether they are true or not. Marcus leaned back slightly. And somehow a husband solves all that. Charlotte released a slow breath. Not completely, but stability matters. Public perception matters. Marcus remained silent. She noticed he never seemed impressed by the language powerful people used. He listened for meaning instead of presentation. You still do not believe this is only business. Charlotte looked at him. Do you? Marcus asked gently. The question landed harder than she expected. For a moment, she stared out the window at pedestrians moving along the sidewalk. Life continued outside without caring about stock prices, corporate politics, or billion-dollar decisions. Maybe it started as business, she admitted. Maybe. Marcus folded his hands together. What changed? Charlotte was not prepared for that question either. She had spent years building walls around every vulnerable part of herself. Yet sitting across from him felt strangely different. Not easy, just different. Safe in a way she could not explain. I am tired, she said quietly. Marcus did not look surprised. Of what? She laughed softly, though there was very little humor in it. Pretending everything is under control. The words hung between them. Charlotte looked down at her coffee. People think money solves loneliness. It does not. It just gives you a more expensive place to feel lonely. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Outside, a child walked past holding a bright red balloon. Somewhere behind the counter, a coffee machine hissed softly. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Marcus finally spoke. My daughter thinks honesty matters more than comfort. Charlotte looked up. That sounds like something you taught her. He smiled. Maybe. But children teach us things too. Charlotte felt something shift inside her. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. For the first time, this conversation no longer felt like a negotiation. It felt personal, dangerous in a completely different way. Marcus glanced at his watch. I need to pick Olivia up soon. Charlotte nodded. Disappointment appeared before she could hide it. Marcus noticed. Of course he did. He seemed to notice everything. He stood and reached for his jacket. Then he paused. If I even consider helping you, there will be conditions. Charlotte looked up immediately. Hope flickered across her face. What kind of conditions? Marcus held her gaze. His expression remained calm, steady, unmovable. The first one is simple. He picked up his coffee and prepared to leave. No lies to my daughter. Not even one. Then he walked toward the door, leaving Charlotte staring after him as a possibility she thought was gone suddenly returned. Charlotte barely slept that night. The conversation in the coffee shop replayed in her mind long after the city lights outside her penthouse faded into darkness. No lies to my daughter. The condition seemed simple, yet it carried more weight than entire contracts she had signed during her career. The next afternoon, she arrived at Marcus Reed's neighborhood earlier than necessary. For several minutes, she remained inside her car, watching ordinary life unfold outside the window. Parents pushed strollers. Teenagers rode bicycles. A delivery truck stopped near the corner. Nothing about the street looked remarkable, yet somehow it felt more real than the world she usually inhabited. When Marcus appeared outside a small community center, he immediately spotted her vehicle. His expression revealed neither surprise nor annoyance, only recognition. Charlotte stepped out of the car. She wore a simple white cashmere sweater and dark jeans instead of the tailored designer clothing she usually preferred. Marcus noticed, but said nothing. You came back, he said. Charlotte nodded. You said there were conditions. Marcus glanced toward the entrance of the building. Children's voices drifted through the open doors. There are. He began walking. After a brief hesitation, Charlotte followed beside him. If we do this, Olivia comes first. Charlotte listened carefully. All right. No pretending around her. All right. No promises we cannot keep. Charlotte looked at him. That sounds difficult for a fake marriage. Marcus smiled faintly. That is because I am not worried about the marriage part. Charlotte frowned. Then what are you worried about? Marcus stopped walking. His attention shifted toward a group of children leaving the building. One little girl with dark curls immediately ran toward him. Olivia. The moment she reached him, she wrapped her arms around his waist. Marcus rested a hand gently on her shoulder. The entire interaction lasted only seconds, yet Charlotte felt herself watching more closely than she intended. "Daddy, are we still getting ice cream?" Olivia asked. That was the plan. Then the little girl noticed Charlotte standing nearby. Curiosity immediately brightened her face. "Oh." Olivia looked from one adult to the other. "You are the lady from the school." Charlotte blinked. "You remember me?" Olivia nodded confidently. "You were sitting in the fancy car." Marcus tried unsuccessfully to hide a smile. Charlotte felt embarrassment for perhaps the first time in months. Olivia stepped closer. "What is your name?" "Charlotte." "I am Olivia." The introduction sounded formal enough to make Marcus laugh quietly. Charlotte found herself smiling in return. It happened naturally. Unexpectedly. Olivia studied her for another second. "Are you Daddy's friend?" The question settled over all three of them. Charlotte glanced toward Marcus. Marcus looked back at her. Neither answered immediately. Finally, Marcus spoke. "We are still figuring that out." Olivia appeared satisfied with the response. She grabbed her father's hand and started pulling him toward the sidewalk. After several steps, she stopped and looked back at Charlotte. "Are you coming with us?" Charlotte felt something warm and unfamiliar move through her chest. Before she could think too much about it, she nodded. And for the first time since all of this began, she walked beside them not as a billionaire, not as a chief executive officer, but simply as a woman stepping into a world she never expected to want. The ice cream shop was only a few blocks away, yet the walk felt strangely significant. Olivia stayed between Charlotte and Marcus, talking about school projects, favorite books, and a science experiment that had almost covered her classroom in foam. Marcus listened with the patience of someone who had heard hundreds of stories and still treated each one like the most important thing in the world. Charlotte found herself smiling more than she expected. At one point, Olivia slipped her hand into Charlotte's without thinking. The gesture lasted only a few seconds before the little girl became distracted by a dog across the street, but the feeling remained. Inside the shop, Olivia spent nearly 3 minutes deciding between flavors before choosing chocolate. Marcus ordered vanilla. Charlotte admitted she had not eaten ice cream in years. Olivia looked horrified. "Years?" Charlotte laughed. "I have been busy." Olivia shook her head with complete seriousness. "That is not a good excuse." Even Marcus laughed at that. They sat near the window while afternoon sunlight filled the room. For the first time in a very long time, Charlotte was not checking emails. She was not reviewing contracts. She was not solving problems. She was simply present. Later, after Olivia finished her ice cream, she excused herself to look at a display of toys near the counter. The moment she was out of earshot, Marcus turned toward Charlotte. "You seem different today." Charlotte looked down at her cup. "Different from what?" "Different from the woman who offered me a contract." She considered that. "Maybe I am." Marcus studied her quietly. There was no judgment in his expression, only curiosity. "What happened?" Charlotte watched Olivia laughing at something near the register. "I realized I do not remember the last time I spent an afternoon without an agenda." Marcus nodded slowly. Most people spend their lives chasing success. And then, sometimes they forget why they started running. The words settled over her. They felt uncomfortably accurate. A few minutes later, Olivia returned carrying a small stuffed bear she clearly wanted but had not asked for. Marcus noticed immediately. So did Charlotte. The little girl tried to act uninterested. It was not convincing. Charlotte almost offered to buy it. Then she stopped herself. Money was always her first solution. Marcus knelt beside his daughter. "You really like it?" Olivia nodded. "A little." Marcus smiled. "Maybe we save up for it." The disappointment on Olivia's face lasted only a second before she nodded too. "Okay." No argument. No frustration. Just trust. Charlotte watched the exchange carefully. Outside her world, people purchased whatever they wanted without hesitation. Yet somehow this simple conversation felt richer than most luxury experiences she knew. When they finally stepped outside, the evening sun painted the neighborhood gold. Olivia walked ahead, humming to herself. Marcus slowed slightly beside Charlotte. "I still have not agreed to anything." Charlotte smiled softly. "I know, but Olivia likes you." Charlotte looked toward the little girl. Something warm moved through her chest again. I like her too. Marcus was quiet for several steps. Then he said something that stayed with her long after the walk ended. That is exactly why we need to be careful. For the first time, Charlotte understood that the real risk was no longer the contract. It was the possibility that all three of them might start caring about each other more than any of them intended. 3 days passed before Charlotte Bennett saw Marcus read again. During those days, the pressure inside her company continued to grow. Meetings stretched longer. Investors asked harder questions. Headlines became more aggressive. Yet none of those things unsettled her as much as the realization that she missed conversations she had no right to miss. Late one evening, after another exhausting board meeting, Charlotte found herself staring out the windows of her penthouse instead of reviewing documents. Manhattan glowed beneath the dark sky. The view was extraordinary. It always had been, yet it felt strangely empty. Her phone buzzed. A message appeared from Marcus. Olivia's school fundraiser is Saturday morning. She asked if you were coming. Charlotte read the sentence twice. Then a third time. A small smile appeared before she could stop it. Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool spring air. The school parking lot was crowded with families, volunteers, and folding tables covered with homemade baked goods. Charlotte stepped out of her car feeling unexpectedly nervous. She had spoken before thousands of shareholders without hesitation. Yet walking into an elementary school fundraiser somehow felt more intimidating. She spotted Olivia immediately. The little girl was helping organize raffle tickets at a booth near the entrance. The moment Olivia saw her, she waved enthusiastically. Charlotte. Several parents turned toward the sound. Charlotte laughed softly and waved back. A few moments later, Olivia was already pulling her toward different attractions. Marcus followed behind, carrying a box of supplies. You seem popular, he said. Charlotte glanced toward Olivia. I think she likes having new people to talk to. Marcus smiled. That makes two of us. The words caught her off guard. For a brief second, neither looked away. Then Olivia interrupted by insisting both adults participate in a ring toss game. An hour later, Charlotte found herself helping decorate a table while Marcus worked nearby. The scene felt absurd if she thought about it logically. A billionaire chief executive officer spending her Saturday morning hanging paper decorations beside a single father. Yet she could not remember the last time she felt this relaxed. Near lunchtime, clouds began rolling across the sky. Parents started packing supplies. Volunteers folded tables. During the cleanup, Charlotte noticed Marcus carrying several heavy boxes toward a storage room. Without thinking, she stepped forward to help. You do not have to do that. I know. Together they carried the boxes inside. The room was quiet once the door closed behind them. For a moment neither spoke. The distant sounds of the fundraiser echoed faintly through the walls. Marcus set down his box and leaned against a table. Charlotte looked around before finally asking the question she had been carrying for days. Why are you really so protective of honesty? Marcus was silent for several seconds. His eyes lowered briefly. When he finally answered, his voice was softer than usual. Because Olivia has already lost enough. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. Marcus rarely talked about himself. Her mother? He nodded once. She passed away when Olivia was very young. Silence settled between them. Charlotte suddenly understood something she had missed before. Marcus was not protecting a rule. He was protecting trust. The one thing his daughter still depended on completely. When she looked at him again, she saw not only strength. She saw grief carried with dignity. And for the first time, she wondered what would happen if she trusted him with the parts of her own story she had spent years hiding from everyone else. After the fundraiser ended, Charlotte Bennett expected life to return to normal. Instead, normal seemed farther away than ever. Monday arrived with the usual flood of meetings, financial reports, and media interviews, but something inside her had shifted. For years, she had built her identity around being indispensable. Every minute of her day had a purpose. Every conversation led somewhere. Yet now, during quiet moments, her thoughts drifted toward a small school gymnasium, a little girl selling raffle tickets, and a man whose strength came from keeping promises instead of making deals. Late Tuesday evening, Charlotte remained alone in her office long after most employees had gone home. The city lights reflected against the glass walls around her. Her desk was covered with reports she should have been reading. Instead, she found herself staring at a framed photograph from a business awards ceremony years earlier. In the picture, she was smiling. The image looked successful. It also looked lonely. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus appeared unexpectedly. Olivia wants to thank you for helping at the fundraiser. Charlotte smiled before she could stop herself. A second message followed. She insisted I tell you she won second place in the raffle competition. Charlotte laughed quietly. The sound surprised her. It had been a long time since anyone made her laugh during a workday. She replied with a short congratulations and expected the conversation to end. Instead, another message appeared several minutes later. She also wants you to know she still thinks you should try more ice cream flavors. Charlotte shook her head, smiling at the screen. For several minutes, they exchanged simple messages about Olivia's latest school project, her favorite books, and a science presentation she was preparing. The conversation contained nothing extraordinary. No negotiations, no contracts, no billion-dollar decisions. Yet when it ended, Charlotte felt lighter than she had all week. The following afternoon, however, reality returned. During a strategy meeting, one of the board members placed a confidential folder in front of her. The contents immediately caught her attention. Legal documents, ownership agreements, deadlines. The situation surrounding the company had become more serious than anyone initially expected. Several decisions would need to be made soon. Difficult decisions. After the meeting ended, Charlotte remained seated long after everyone else had left. She stared at the documents without moving. For the first time, she questioned whether the company was the real reason she had approached Marcus in the first place. That evening, she drove herself home instead of using a driver. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as traffic crawled through Manhattan. At a red light, her phone buzzed again. A photograph appeared on the screen. Olivia stood beside a half-finished science project, proudly holding a cardboard display covered in handwritten notes. Marcus had sent only one sentence. She worked on this for 3 hours. Charlotte stared at the image longer than necessary. Something about it felt important. Real. More real than the stack of legal documents sitting in the passenger seat beside her. The traffic light turned green. Cars moved forward. Yet Charlotte remained still for a moment, looking at the photograph. Somewhere between board meetings and school fundraisers, between contracts and conversations, she had crossed an invisible line. The problem was no longer whether Marcus would agree to help her. The problem was that she was beginning to care what happened to him and his daughter. And that made everything far more complicated than any contract ever could. Friday afternoon arrived with more uncertainty than Charlotte Bennett cared to admit. The legal deadlines sitting on her desk felt closer now. The board wanted answers. Investors wanted confidence. Everyone expected her to make the right decision. Yet the only thing she felt certain about was that her life no longer fit neatly into the categories she had relied on for years. Near the end of the day, her assistant informed her that a package had been delivered. Charlotte expected legal documents. Instead, she found a large envelope covered in colorful stickers. The handwriting on the front immediately made her smile. Olivia read. Charlotte carefully opened it. Inside was a folded piece of construction paper. Crayon drawings covered the page. One picture showed a little girl standing between a tall man and a woman with long hair. Above them, written in uneven letters, was a simple sentence. Thank you for helping my dad smile more. Charlotte stared at the drawing. The office around her seemed to disappear. For several moments, she simply sat there holding the paper. Nobody had thanked her for something so personal in a very long time. Most people thanked her for investments, donations, or business opportunities. This was different. This came from a child who measured value in happiness rather than success. Later that evening, Charlotte drove to the neighborhood where Marcus and Olivia lived. She did not call ahead. She was not entirely sure why she had come. The construction paper rested carefully on the passenger seat beside her. As she approached the apartment building, she noticed lights glowing from a second-floor window. Through the glass, she could see movement inside. Marcus was helping Olivia with homework at the kitchen table. The scene looked ordinary, quiet, real. Charlotte remained outside for a moment longer than necessary. Then she finally walked toward the entrance. A few minutes later, Marcus opened the door. Surprise crossed his face. Charlotte. She held up the drawing. I think this belongs to your daughter. Marcus looked at the paper and smiled immediately. She spent an hour making that. Before Charlotte could respond, Olivia appeared behind him. The little girl's face lit up. You came. Charlotte laughed softly. Apparently I did. Olivia stepped forward and hugged her without hesitation. The gesture was so sudden that Charlotte froze for a second before gently returning it. Something warm settled inside her chest. Something she had spent years pretending she did not need. A few minutes later, they sat together at the small kitchen table. Olivia talked about school, while Marcus prepared hot chocolate. The apartment was modest. The furniture did not match. The kitchen was small. Yet Charlotte felt more comfortable there than she often felt inside her penthouse. At one point, Olivia yawned, and Marcus reminded her it was almost bedtime. The little girl looked between them carefully. Then she asked a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. Will Charlotte still be around next month? Silence filled the room. Marcus looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at Marcus. Neither answered right away. Because for the first time, neither of them knew what the honest answer was. And somewhere deep inside, Charlotte realized that frightened her far more than any board meeting ever could.